Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of our co-sponsor for today's event, the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, I want to welcome you out to our panel discussion today. This is actually our 8th annual symposium on science, ethics, and public policy, which we began to try to highlight some of these really interesting issues. Today's symposium, Why is Science Such a Hard Sell in Public Policy Making, could hardly be more topical given recent controversies surrounding a diverse array of topics, from climate change to stem cell research and reproductive rights to evolutionary theory in public education. These are all very controversial topics that involve the politicization of science. Even though science holds the hope of providing answers to many of society's most pressing problems, our panelists today will tell us why it is sometimes ignored and often politicized. So thankfully, my role today is almost over. I'm going to turn over the event to our moderator, who will introduce our other panelists and also have something to say about the topic himself. Bill Cabasenci is my colleague and an associate professor in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, as well as a fellow in the Center for Reproductive Biology and the Center for Integrated Biotechnology. His research looks specifically at ethical issues that intersect developments in healthcare and biotechnology with moral psychology and identity. In recent work, Bill has examined the ethics of enhanced moral capacities via biotechnology, as well as ethical issues connected to the emerging science of epigenetics. So join me now in welcoming Bill Cabasenci, who will introduce the event.
Thanks, Cornell. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm very happy to be able to be a part of this event. The Science, Ethics, Public Policy series examines issues at the intersection of science, ethics, and public policy. And as Dr. Clayton said, we've been doing this for 8 years now, and we haven't run out of topics yet. Turns out there are a lot of interesting things to think about at the intersection of those 3 areas. In December of 2017, the journal Scientific American published an article titled, "A Year of Trump, Science is the Major Casualty in the New Politics of Disruption." And that article discussed a number of ways that science has been politicized to what many think are unprecedented levels in modern times. For instance, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, hinting at skepticism about the fundamental science of the climate. He's left the position of the White House Science Advisor, officially the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He's left that position open longer than any president in modern history. I should say, as an aside, my own research is in biomedical ethics, and he's also the first president since Bill Clinton in the mid-1990s not to have a bioethics advisory council, which I find disappointing given my own interests. But this uneasy relationship between science and politics is not just occurring at a national level. It's actually quite close to home as well. We have a professor here at Washington State University called Robert Wildgus, and in December he announced his intention to sue the university for what he claims are its efforts to silence him and to call his research on wolves into question. In published reports in newspapers, you can read about allegations that lobbyists and politicians threatened to defund the new College of Medicine here at Washington State University if Wildgus wasn't silenced and his research wasn't downplayed and basically disavowed by the university. So this is quite a timely topic, I think, for many sorts of reasons. Let me just briefly say what the format will be, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'll get to sit down and hear what they have to say. So each of them will give about a 15 to 20-minute presentation to start, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions for any or all members of the panel. Okay. So first of all, to my immediate left is Dr. Patricia Hunt. Dr. Hunt's a geneticist here in the School of Molecular Biology at Washington State. Her laboratory focuses on mammalian germ cells and meiosis. And a number of years ago, and this is why she's on this panel, her research serendipitously led her to discover the pernicious effects of bisphenol A, or what's sometimes referred to as BPA, which is often found in plastics. Turns out this is not such a great substance for the endocrine system in humans and other mammals. And Dr. Hunt has quite a few experiences related to trying to get her research translated into meaningful public policy concerning BPA. And she was, I'm very happy to say, just awarded the Carl G. Hartman Award from the Society for the Study of Reproduction, which is that society's highest honor. So she'll go first, and then she'll be followed by Dr. Kristen Intiman, who is the chair of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies in the Department of History and Philosophy at Montana State University. Her research focuses on ethics, values, and science, and on feminist philosophy of science. And Dr. Intiman has a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press on the subject of today's discussion. The book is titled The Fight Against Doubt: How to Bridge the Gap Between Scientists and the Public. And she told me that that book will be coming out in June, so you can look for that. And Dr. Intiman is not a stranger to the state of Washington. She went to another university here. She actually went to the University of Washington, but we're not going to hold that against her. I'm very glad that she's here with us today. And then finally, sitting at the far end of the table, my colleague in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, Dr. Stephen Steer. He's in fact the director of the school, where he teaches and does research in the area of American public policy and environmental policy. Dr. Steer was a co-coordinator of the Sea Inspire project here at WSU, which was an integrated disciplinary training program for a select group of graduate students in a variety of the earth sciences with training in the field of public policy. And the goal of that program was to facilitate development of what they were referring to as boundary spanners, which is scientists who can work at the edges of science and public policy. So I'm very grateful that each one of these panelists is here, and they're going to go in order from my left to further left. And so we'll do science, ethics, and then public policy. So to begin, please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Hunt.
Thank you, Bill. Can you hear me through this? Is it coming through okay? Great. Okay, so I'm the example of the scientist who gets caught in the crosshairs between my science, the feds, and regulatory procedures, and industry. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that story, but I want to preface it by telling you that I think that right now we have a serious problem, and that is U.S. science is not healthy. And in fact, I would say this is a pivotal moment in science. I've spent 30 years running an independent lab. That's longer than some of you have had feet touching the earth. And in that time, the U.S. has always been a place that trainees wanted to come and train because this was the best training ground for a career in science. And we've trained a lot of tremendous scientists. And now I worry that we're actually giving up our place as leaders in science. And I worry about this for several reasons. One, we're not investing in a way that's going to make us or keep us competitive. China and India are spending a ton of money investing in the infrastructure, building great research institutions, grant money for scientists, and they're bringing back all those wonderful scientists, many of whom were trained in this country and in Europe, and they're leading these institutes and these laboratories. You know, we're also demeaning science. Scientists deal in facts, you know, we look for truth, right? Sounds like we should all have S's on our chest. Okay, we're not that great. But we deal in facts. We get data to try to understand what reality is. So the idea that facts are malleable is just, it's really hard for us to understand. And lastly, you know, we're politicizing science. And it's my opinion that really politicians and industry are not the people who should be interpreting the science that we do and understanding what it means to humans. So based on where I've been and what I've seen in the last 20 years, I have a new goal. And my goal is to make sure that the next generation of scientists is better trained and better able to talk to the real world than my generation is. And more importantly, I want them to realize that this is part of their job. This is what they need to be doing. So that's my personal mission, and I'm going to tell you how I came to believe this and why I am the weird scientist who will stand up and talk to people willingly, because most of us don't like to talk to people. And that is, as Bill alluded to, when my science became newsworthy, we were conducting experiments. I work on eggs and sperm. I'm really interested in problems in making eggs and sperm because we as a species don't do such a good job of it. I'm especially interested in eggs, and we happen to be studying eggs using the mouse as a model, when all of a sudden all of our data went completely haywire and all of the eggs from our normal control female mice started to look really bad. And we realized after about a month of chasing our tail trying to figure out what had happened, that our animals were being inadvertently exposed to BPA, or bisphenol A. And it's because their cages and water bottles had been damaged and it was starting to leach this chemical and they were being exposed to us. At the time, this was not a household word. People did not know what it was. There was a little bit of research out there, but it really wasn't on anybody's radar screen yet. So we started to realize what was going on, and I got really interested in this because it created such an interesting effect on the egg. I started telling my scientist friends about it and talking a little bit about it when I went to meetings, and one of them said, hey, you know, we're going to have this guy named Pete Myers come to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and you should come up and hear his talk and then go to dinner with us. And I said, okay. Pete Myers had written Our Stolen Future in 1996, and that book came out saying he co-wrote this with 2 other authors, and they had this hypothesis that these chemicals that we're being exposed to that can behave like hormones in our bodies are actually interfering with our health and the health of other species. So they wrote a book providing evidence from wildlife and changes in humans. And Pete came and he gave a really great talk, and I walked up to him afterwards, introduced myself, said thank you, that was a great talk. And I told him a little bit about what we were seeing, and his eyes got really wide. And then he asked me really strange questions. He said, so are you tenured? And I said, yeah, I'm a tenured associate professor. Oh, good, good. Do you have research grants? And I said, yeah, I've got 2 NIH grants. Oh, oof. And I said, like, why? He said, well, you know, if you were young, just starting out, industry would try everything they could to undermine you, discredit you, and make sure your institution never gave you tenure. And I was like, really? I went to dinner with those guys that night, and I sat and I listened to them tell stories about their brushes with industry and their world. I went home, I don't think I slept a wink all night long, thinking, what have I got myself into? Well, what I got myself into was the best of possible situations, because Pete said to me, we need to do media training for you before you release your story. So he did. And I thought, I'm pretty good, I could talk pretty well. And then I realized when I started to prepare my remarks, he said, write out the questions you think they'll ask you, and then write out the answers. Okay, I realized I talk in jargon. It was all scientific jargon, and I couldn't say this to people because they wouldn't get it. And so I had to really think about the words I would select and really, really answer my questions differently. Those interviews were me, every one of them was a real learning experience. So my paper was published, and I probably did 30-some interviews in the next 3 weeks. I learned something every time. One of the things I learned is, you know, we really aren't good at this. And industry's really, really good at this because they have pros. And we have scientists who like to qualify everything. So in my case, I would say, well, you know, we do these studies on mice, but of course we don't know about humans. Well, people don't want to know that. And the press, that's not a story for them. They want to say, we found this in the eggs from mice, and what this means for humans is, well, I don't know what it means for, I'm not comfortable with, I don't have that data yet. And so I really realized that we had to find ways to have a voice, but be comfortable with what we were saying. One of my favorite phrases became, we know enough to know that we should be very concerned. You know, based on this work, we know enough to know that we as a human species should be very concerned. I had a really powerful awakening early in my interviews. At the end of every interview, they almost always ask you, so is there anything else we should have asked? Or is there anything else you'd like to tell us? And I was captivated by baby bottles, because baby bottles were all made of polycarbonate plastic, which is made of bisphenol A. And we knew that they were really easy to damage with just a detergent that was a little bit high in pH. And so I was really worried, because I thought all of these babies and infants they're sucking water and juice and milk out of baby bottles, and they're taking in this BPA. So I would always say, you know, I worry that we're placing this chemical into the hands of the most vulnerable segment of our society, our babies and our infants. Well, boom, the world just blew up because parents started calling companies and asking what baby bottles were made of, and baby bottle companies started calling me and saying, what the hell is going on at your university? And all of a sudden, new polymers came on the market. They weren't all polycarbonate anymore. There were new types of plastics. And parents were asking for what they want, and they were getting it. So at the same time that me and a small group of scientists were thinking, how do we take these results and change the regulatory process, I realized it's not my science baby that's going to change the regulatory process. It's being able to talk to people. And we need to learn to do this really well. So that was my aha moment. So from there, you know, as you might imagine, I started to get into a lot of venues that I wasn't comfortable with. Parent support groups, going in front of state legislators as BPA, should we ban BPA from baby bottles, and talking widely to groups that I didn't really know. Physician groups, you know, working groups of scientists across the world who were trying to decide what we should do to provide regulatory information for regulatory panels. And I realized that I was learning a lot, but I was starting to feel like I was struggling because I wanted to be a scientist and maintain my credibility, but I felt like I was becoming an activist, and it was really making me nervous. My peers kind of looked at me, some of them said, like, she's just getting high on this, you know, publicity stuff, you know. Others would say, you know, why don't you come to our meeting and tell your little environmental story? I think people would be interested in that. So I was exotic at a meeting for a couple of years. And then slowly more and more scientists became aware, and these meetings turned into whole meetings on this subject of these chemicals and whole sessions at other meetings. So I saw that grow. And then some of my peers started to actually walk up to me and say, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. It's like, I'm doing my job. What do you mean, thank you for what I'm doing? But I realized that speaking out is rare. And that's because we don't trust the media. And we think most of the public couldn't understand what we're talking about anyway. So I have colleagues who say they always get it wrong. And I now say, if they get it wrong, it's because I didn't explain it well enough to make them understand it. When I moved here, my boss said, you know, I hate the way they just call you, these journalists, they call you out of the blue, they need to talk now. And they just don't give you the questions in advance, they expect you to just answer them. And I realized, well, I totally understood that because they were on deadline, they probably had to file their story by 4 o'clock this afternoon. They were trying to get a balanced view, and they needed to talk to somebody who could provide the answers, and you needed to be able to provide those answers. So one of the people who had the most profound impact on my career was somebody who was my boss early on. And he did a lot of PR work in the medical school that I worked with. And one day there were these guys with cameras on their shoulder getting into the elevator, and as he got into the elevator with him, he said, remind me what it is we're talking about today. And I went, oh my gosh, how can you do that? Because like I'd have to have everything prepared in advance. And now I realize that this is my mission, to make every scientist willing, ready, and able to talk at any point in time about any aspect of their research or their field. Because I think that's what the world needs, and I think that's what science needs. And I'm going to stop there and pass the baton.
I'm going to stand up because I'm going to try to have a couple slides here. So first, I actually just want to take the time to thank both the Foley Institute and Washington State for having me here, and also to everyone for overlooking the fact that I'm a former Husky. Okay. So I've been working on a project very related to the topics as Bill kind of laid out. and in particular about the role that the commercialization of science and the kind of private industry that Pat was just talking about, and the ways both in which they're generating science in some cases, and in some cases also what other people have called manufacturing doubt, right? Doubt about various scientific claims that are otherwise widely accepted in the scientific community. And in fact, this is from a poll, Pew poll from 2015, but we see this gap on a ton of issues. So, for example, about 50% of the US public believes that climate change is happening as a result of human activity, whereas an overwhelming majority of scientists believe that to be the case. It's also the case that there's pretty wide resistance in the US and other countries too, the UK. We're starting to see this not just here, but to adopting certain climate policies. And in fact, as Bill mentioned earlier, obviously the Trump administration has now pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So despite the fact that there's this big consensus among scientists, there seems to be resistance to both believing it and to, policies that people think would follow from that science. Another example is with GMOs. And it's interesting to note about 88% of AAAS scientists, that's the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, and believe that GMOs are safe, whereas only about 37% of the public agree. And indeed, about 95% of the public in the US support GMO labeling in general, in part because of concerns about GMO safety. Another recent example is, despite the fact that there's been virtually no evidence that there's a link between the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and autism, there seems to be a persistent fear that some link exists. And an increasing number of parents are disregarding the advice of pediatricians and not vaccinating their children. So diseases like measles and mumps that really were pretty much eradicated from the Western world are now coming back in increasingly higher and concerning numbers. So as Bill mentioned, I just finished working on a book with Immaculata de Mello Martin from Cornell Medical University. And we really kind of have two central questions that I'm going to try to touch on both of these today. One is just what are the causes of this gap? That is, why is there this gap between the public or laypersons, policymakers on one hand, and then scientists? And what can scientists and scientific communities do about it? Okay? So the first question, what are the causes of the gap? There are many, many different causes, actually. It's fairly complicated. One, a lot of people tend to think, well, the problem is scientific illiteracy, right? That people just don't understand the science that's out there. And in some cases, that is certainly true. And if that were the cause, then it seems like what would follow is, just try to educate the public, right, better about science. And while that certainly seems like a good thing, it's not clear that that's going to be enough. And in some cases, particularly with respect to some climate change research, I mean, it's actually fairly complicated research to understand. So there may be, simply a kind of pragmatic problem of, the difficulty in communicating some of these ideas. Another possible cause of the gap between scientists and the public there's been a lot of social scientist research to show that there are a lot of cognitive biases that exist, right? For example, confirmation bias. People are just kind of more inclined to believe those claims that nicely cohere with other things they want to believe, right? That it's you're more inclined to give more weight to things that fit well with what you want to believe and less inclined to give weight to evidence that cuts against that, right? Another issue is what some political scientists and researchers have called kind of like tribalism. There's been some research showing that party affiliation, for example, is a very good predictor for whether or not people believe in things like climate change. The idea is that people kind of retreat into this tribalist mentality, right? My side is for that, or my side doesn't believe that, we're against that. And so that really, a kind of closedness really on both sides to thinking about why people might think differently. Another big factor, and this touches on some of the concerns that Pat raised in her comments, is that industry, private industry, is doing a lot to create think tanks, give money in order to really generate doubt, uncertainty, publish non-peer-reviewed types of publications to try to challenge claims made by the IPCC or by scientists. And climate change is just one example, but this is happening systematically in many other cases. In the climate change case, Robert Bruhl did a study that he published in 2013, and to what he referred to as the climate change counter-movement. And he identified 91 conservative or free market organizations that engaged in a kind of coordinated effort to put out publications, to hold conferences, to do things that would really challenge certain scientific claims. And his data only goes to 2013, by the way, because that's when we had a Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. And since that court decision, it's actually incredibly hard to track this money. But they had a total annual budget of over $90 million US, right? Annual budget, right? One example of this is the American Enterprise Institute, which is run by the Koch brothers, and is basically almost entirely funded by Exxon, right? And they offered, just as one example, they sent letters to some scientists offering $10,000 for any article that would challenge the IPCC's fourth assessment report about climate change. Many scientists obviously kind of balked at that. It seemed like they were concerned, they were offering money in exchange for research they liked. They responded that they were just trying to have critical research funded. So the question is, what do we do about this, right? How do we bridge the gap? How do we, given all of these things, from industry to biases to lack of public understanding of science in some cases, what can scientists in particular do? And one strategy that a lot of scientists have adopted, particularly in relation to the climate change case, but increasingly with the vaccine education and also with GMOs, is to really kind of try to publicize better the fact that an overwhelming scientific consensus exists, right? Some people don't even realize that there's a scientific consensus about some of these issues. So this is one example from Cook and colleagues from 2013. They did a study which actually involved a lot of citizen scientists, where they did a sort of analysis of all, I think it was like 13,000 abstracts and scientific articles, to show that for those that took a position on anthropogenic climate change, 97% of those agreed in anthropogenic climate change. And actually, they reported kind of conservative numbers because the number went up as you got to like more narrow areas of science. If you survey, for example, people that do climate modeling or do climate change research, that number may be, in fact, higher. And in 2016, they published another paper about all the studies that had been done on scientific consensus on climate change, called The Consensus on Consensus, just to try to drive it home even further, right? So overwhelming census. But I have some concerns about whether or not this is the right strategy, although there's some evidence, again, that this has been effective in some cases. I worry that maybe at least it shouldn't be the only strategy that we pursue, because there are some limitations about emphasizing consensus to people. One is that consensus sometimes is communicated in a way that oversimplifies things. So, what do 97% of scientists agree on? Well, they agree on the very modest claim that average global temperature is increasing and that it's caused by humans, right? And that there's a range probably somewhere between 1.7 and 4 degrees Celsius that we would expect to see in 100 years. Right? But really, the problem is that kind of oversimplifies the situation, because there are in fact real disagreements between scientists about things like how much warming we're going to see, how fast that's going to happen, what's going to happen in the event of sort of tipping point extreme climate events. It also, there are some people that disagree because they think the current predictions of climate models are actually, they underestimate the amount of warming that we're going to see. So the worry is that by emphasizing consensus, you kind of lose some of the nuance, and some of the genuine disagreements between scientists might be masked, and those disagreements might actually be relevant for public policy or for making good public policy decisions. The other worry I have about emphasizing consensus is that I think it sets the bar pretty high for public policy, right? I mean, 97%, that's a lot. And of course, there are many times when we have to make public policy decisions when we don't have anything like that sort of consensus, right? Where there might be significant disagreements about what evidence we have for the toxicity of a substance, but we have to make some decision about whether or not to regulate it or not. And so I worry that it sets a public expectation that we won't enact policy unless we have almost near unanimity. And that seems to set the bar kind of high. Also, it's only effective, emphasizing consensus, insofar as laypersons really trust scientists. So, for example, there was a 2011 Rasmussen poll that showed that about 69% of American adults, 69%, think it's at least somewhat likely that climate change scientists fabricate data, right? That's kind of shocking, That suggests, so when they're saying 97%, 97%, if 69% of the public thinks that, emphasizing consensus isn't going to help, right? If they already don't trust what climate scientists are doing. There's another strategy that some people have used, and some of you might be familiar with Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt. There was also a documentary subsequently made about this. And one of the things they do sort of an amazing job of is looking at sort of this, looking at some of the people who have been very public climate skeptics and showing that some of these same scientists that have been vocal opponents of climate change, for example, are in fact paid by industry. And indeed, they're the same people that tried to manufacture doubt about the harmful effects of cigarette smoking, and they were paid by the tobacco companies. So, they do a nice job, I think, of showing that there was a consistent strategy on the part of industry to discredit science and looking at that. The worry I have about this, though, and we philosophers often are quick to point this out. I mean, there's a little bit of what we call ad hominem here, sort of attacking the person, right, rather than the kinds of arguments they're making. And of course, one of the worries I have is that if we're going to discredit dissenters and say that's a reason not to believe people because they have conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest or something, the worry is the same thing could also be said about many scientists, right? So in fact, Rachenda Pachauri, who was chair of the IPCC for about 10 years, he in fact owned a for-profit alternative energy company that certainly could have benefited from climate change policies. And so the claim was, he has conflicts of interest too, therefore he's biased. Similarly, lots of people are concerned about GMO research precisely because a lot of it has been funded by Monsanto, right? And indeed, vaccine skeptics think that it's the vaccine companies that are not allowing them to, that a lot of the research is being suppressed, right? So there's a little, the fact that there's financial conflicts of interest doesn't necessarily mean research is biased, right? There's lots of amazing research that gets done and amazing drug interventions and all kinds of things that come out that are incredibly successful that are paid for with private money, industry money. So we have to kind of be careful about casting stones, so to speak, in that regard. So the question is, and I'll try to wrap up here quickly, but what is the alternative if, what else can we do to kind of address this gap? And so one of the things that we propose in our book is that it might be helpful to kind of reframe the problem as one of trust rather than one of ignorance. That perhaps the problem is not that the public is stupid, or that, or even just that scientists are bad communicators in communicating it to the public, but that also we need to have scientific practices, institutions that facilitate and maintain trust in scientists. The fact is that even scientists, even individual scientists, have to trust other scientists. No one can be an expert on everything. We have to be able to trust the testimony of experts at times. So how might we try to do that? By adopting practices that might better generate and facilitate trust between scientists and the public. It may, instead of just, for example, communicating that there's an overwhelming consensus about climate change, it might be helpful to communicate the features of the research that make it trustworthy, right? The fact that many climate models have made good predictions, have made novel predictions. The fact that we have, no other competing theory that really does it. The fact that a lot of research is peer-reviewed and subject to a lot of scrutiny from lots of different people. The fact that we have research in all kinds of different areas, from ice scientists to geologists to climate modelers to oceanographers, that are all collecting evidence that seems to converge on the claim that average temperature is increasing. We also may need to have, in fact, stronger conflict of interest policies, right? That indeed, people are wary of companies like Monsanto, like Merck, precisely because they're concerned that they don't have the public's best interest at heart, that they're concerned more about profit. And we also might need better protections against bias. For example, philosopher Julian Rees makes the recommendation that we have an independent clinical trial board where drug companies, if they want a drug tested, they pay a fee, and then the scientists doing the clinical trials, they don't even know whose company the drug is, right? They just independently test it to try to avoid bias. We also need greater transparency about methods, but also even about some of the value judgments that do indeed have to be made in making scientific decision making, and making those clear to the public so that they understand how risks, for example, or safety standards are being calculated, right? Also increasing diversity and inclusivity in science, right? So that you have a more diverse group practicing science can also help facilitate trust with the public. And enhancing collaboration with stakeholders by doing things like citizen science, involving stakeholders more directly in research so that people feel slightly more ownership of that. Now, like all philosophers, I probably just raised more questions than I provided answers, but hopefully that just kind of gives you a little bit of an overview. And now I'll turn it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. So when you get old like me, you start seeing things more in historical context. So I thought it might be useful just to spend a few minutes putting this discussion in historical context, because the belief in the value of science and expertise has varied throughout American history. If you go back to the very beginning, we had these elite gentlemen, intellectuals like Madison and Jefferson and John Quincy Adams, who ran things. And then, of course, as a response to that, Andrew Jackson brought a profound dislike and mistrust of experts and specialists. And for large swatches of the 19th century, that's the view that prevailed, until, of course, the progressive era, when the embracement of scientific management and sanitary engineering and all manner of things sort of rescued science. The golden age of science was right after World War II, when, owing to the Cold War, federal government began funding all manner of projects to try and keep us safe from the Soviet menace. I'm old enough to remember when they introduced the new math in the early 60s and late 50s to try and increase our ability to compete with the Russians. Of course, by the 1960s, science and the sort of consensual reality began to become under attack, beginning early from the new age left. Of course, the Academy contributed to this with studies talking about the social construction of reality, the attacks on industrial science in the environmental movement. All of these things began calling into question the value of science. And then, of course, by the 1990s and the 2000s, we have the replacement of broadcasting with narrowcasting. So we've got all sorts of channels we can tune into, the creation of Fox News, the World Wide Web. So all of these things gave birth or gave voice to these alternative realities. And so by 2004, some of you may remember Karl Rove, senior advisor to President Bush, could say, quote, "People in the reality-based community believe that solutions emerge from the judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world works anymore." And of course, the very next year, Stephen Colbert, in his very first episode of his new program, coined the word of the day, truthiness, which he claimed he was doing it in defiance of what he called the wordinistas. And that brings us, of course, to alternative realities, fake news, Tom Nichols' book from last fall, The Death of Expertise. Joel Achenbach can write in the National Geographic about the age of disbelief. And so we seem to be at a crisis stage. And so that brings us to the question, I guess, of the day. Is there a war on science? And in the time-honored tradition of academics everywhere, I'm going to say yes and no. It's complex, okay? There's a lot of data out there that shows that there isn't a wholesale rejection of science. Just for example, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey, 76% of the American people said they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public. That's more than any other group except for the military. And so there seems to be some belief that scientists are acting in the public interest. NSF, the National Science Foundation, found that 75% of Americans favor government funding for basic research. Now, this was a study that's 2 years old now, and I've seen some more recent studies that show that Republicans, even in the last 2 years, are separating themselves from Democrats on that question. Another measure, federal research and development spending as a percentage of total discretionary spending, and I realize I'm slicing the bologna pretty thin here, that amount of spending on R&D at the federal level has been constant at 10 to 12% since the middle of the 1970s. And so it's not like we're defunding science at the federal level. I also find it kind of ironic that some of the writers who are writing about, quote, America is facing an epistemic crisis are doing so for political reasons. They have a political agenda for raising these alarms. Certainly, the Trump administration has done a number of things by not filling vacancies, by trying to sanitize information, and all sorts of other things that you've probably read about. These steps really do have real impacts, as do assaults on other institutions like journalism and the academy. Colleges and universities are under attack. From my perspective, though, rather than an assault on science per se, these political attacks are more selective and are more issue-specific. And so the attacks are used to defend a worldview, and that worldview is connected to a way of life. And these worldviews are not just based on ideology or partisanship, but they have to do with gender, geography, religion, language, all sorts of other indicators of who we are. Kristen already mentioned some of the Pew Research Center data when they surveyed some AAAS scientists and the general public, and there's sure wide separations. I'm not sure if that's all a mistrust of science or a misunderstanding of the science behind some of these complex issues, but there are also some issues where there are very small differences when it comes to space travel or the use of bioengineered fuel. And so I don't think there's a wholesale rejection of science. So why is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, I think there's really two ways to look at this. One is that I think there's been some changes in science over the last 30 or so years. A guy named Daniel Sarowitz, who's a professor at Arizona State, published an article about 15 years ago with the provocative title, How Science Makes Environmental Controversies Worse. And the theme of this article is that there's too much good science, and that anybody that has a political value can find science to support their point of view. Not only is there too much good science, it's done from a variety of different disciplinary fields at different levels of analysis, and done using a variety of methodological tools. I think this goes to something that Kristen was talking about with climate change. Yeah, we agree, or there's a consensus on the climate's changing and that humans are probably, largely responsible, but there's all sorts of other questions that aren't settled. And this is true of GMOs, it's true of all sorts of issues. And so this idea that science can help resolve controversies, he's saying we're overselling what science can do, particularly in cases when there's values in conflict. And so you'll note that these sorts of questions where there's values in conflict and a certain amount of disunity, this doesn't allow for the operation of what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, where we sort of solve smaller puzzles and put them together. Instead, we have what some people are calling a post-normal science, where the issues are in flux, values are in conflict, the stakes are very high, and we got to make some decisions relatively quickly. Now, policy entrepreneurs can take advantage of this uncertainty and the value conflict, and so they can create alternative explanations, or what we call narratives, to explain how the world works. So, for example, the opioid crisis in the news. Over the last couple of weeks, I've seen these explanations. These are all pulled from the news. These are various explanations that have been offered for what's causing the opioid crisis. Greedy pharmaceutical companies, porous borders with Mexico. You can probably figure out who some of these people are attached to. Too much government health care. If we didn't give them the Medicaid to buy the opioids, then they wouldn't get hooked on them. Doctors changing views of health or of pain management, feelings of helplessness in the working class. Jeff Sessions the other he said it's the availability of recreational marijuana, because marijuana is a gateway drug to the opioids. All of these have the character of attaching solutions, a preferred solution to a problem, instead of the other way around. So we've got it kind of bass-ackwards in terms of assigning causation to these problems. So I think changes in science is part of the issue. The other change I think that's important, and again, this is repeating a little bit of what Kristen and what Pat had to say, is changes in, and I'm going to use the air quotes, politics, because I think it's more than just politics. Now, most of you have probably heard the news that people in the United States are becoming increasingly polarized. If you haven't, you're living under a rock, I believe. But it's more than simple partisanship or ideology. But instead, it's competing worldviews. It encompasses politics, economics, religion, geography, a whole matter of social identity issues. And you use the word tribes, and you see that language used a lot. Henry Adams, in The Education of Henry Adams, wrote that politics as a practice, whatever its professions, had always been the systematic organization of hatreds. And so I think that's partly what we're seeing. It's not embracing issues as much as hating on the other groups. So it's not simply a matter of more science communication. Dan Kahane, who's one of the leading students of what he calls motivated reasoning, said the issue of climate change isn't about what you know, it's about who you are. If it was a matter of more information, that would be an easier problem to solve than the entrenched sort of views. I won't go through all these different, and you touched on some of them. Party identification and ideology help us explain views on climate change, evolution. Mostly these issues tend to cluster in certain areas, like climate, energy, and environmental issues. These are the areas where I think the various tribes are feeling most threatened You mentioned Merchants of Doubt. I think the real takeaway from that book and the documentary isn't that these people were taking money to shape their science, is they were genuinely frightened that their way of life was threatened, and that they would have to stop eating meat or taking jet airplanes or drive cars. And so they weren't just in it for the money. They felt their worldviews were being threatened. And this isn't just a right-wing thing either. I'd remind you that 4 years ago, the people of Portland rather overwhelmingly voted down putting fluoride in their water supply. And they did it on the basis of they didn't want government putting chemicals in their water, even though there's demonstrated scientific benefits, especially for poor children who may not get access to regular health care. And so it's not just a right-wing phenomena, but it goes on both sides. Just to finish up, my own work has focused on a different kind of set of questions, and it relates to how research and knowledge is utilized in individual policy debates. This is premised on, maybe I'll go old school PowerPoint and go to the board just for a second. It's premised on the idea that there are 4 potential relationships between knowledge and policy. One is the linear model, where knowledge directly feeds into public policy. The other, or another one, is that policy politicizes the knowledge, the sort of Serowitz's view. Another is that there's an interactive effect, sort of a problem-solving model of research utilization. And then finally, there's one where there's a complete separation between knowledge and politics, or public policy. Alvin Weinberg called these trans science issues, issues where no matter how much science you bring to bear, things like abortion, gun control, people aren't going to change their views on the basis of science. Now, there's an optimistic view that goes along with that separation too. Carol Weiss talked about the Enlightenment model of policymaking, where there's stuff floating around in the ether, and some of it gets into policymaking and some of it doesn't. But what I'm suggesting is that if you look at different policy debates, you see different relationships between knowledge and politics. To use BPA, I think it's pretty clear that we don't want to poison babies or anyone else. And your work notwithstanding, the FDA has so far failed to make it illegal. Now there has been, the manufacturers did take a step to take it out voluntarily out of things that babies were going to be drinking out of or eating out of. But there seems to be, at least in terms of federal policy making, some uncertainty over the science. And then some people, students ask me, well, when does knowledge directly go to policy? I think the best example was ozone depletion. The federal government reacted remarkably fast once the science showed that depletion of the ozone layer was going to lead to a factor of 10 increase in skin cancers. Nobody wanted skin cancer. The one purveyor of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, was DuPont. They found a substitute, so they didn't fight it. And within 3 years, EPA had ruled it, had regulated it so that we don't use that anymore. And so there are all sorts of other examples you could come up with, but my own approach is to look at science on a sort of an issue-by-issue sort of basis. And I'll stop there so that we have time for questions.
I don't know why I feel like I should stand up now. So one of the really wonderful things about these events is they give us a chance to ask some experts their thoughts on a variety of different questions. So I have questions, but I'm going to start by giving you all the opportunity. Does anybody here have a question they'd like to pose for any of the members of the panel? Yes, go ahead.
So the Trump administration recently banned the CDC from including some words in their reports such as diversity and climate change. Do you guys think that, and to anybody, do you think that that digs us into a deeper hole in terms of science policy, and what do you think the long-term effects are of that?
I read that was fake news. Seriously. I read that the CDC denied that they did that.
All right.
If they did do that, that would be bad.
Yes.
I have a quick of people believe that scientists are making up climate change or in their findings. You know, you spoke briefly on it about being like a conservative and liberal kind of issue of button heads over that. Like, you know, you have right-wing publications like PragerU on Facebook saying that, you know, climate change, the greenhouse gases have been way high back thousands and almost millions of years ago, even higher than today. And then, you know, I take an ecology class, and by 2050, the oceans are going to be so acidic that, you know, crabs won't even have shells, hard shells anymore. So do you think it's kind of a culmination of how, like, fake news is kind of spread, like this misinformation through various outlets that we receive, the way we receive information?
Yeah, so I do think it is complicated, and also I agree with what you said, that it's not like just a conservative thing or just, you know, it's both. Because, I mean, the one of the reasons I find the GMO case and the vaccine case interesting is precisely because in the case of GMOs, it tends to be liberals that don't trust the research on GMOs. And similarly, parents who aren't vaccinating their children tends to be white, middle to upper class, well-educated women, which is interesting. So, I mean, I think that, you know, again, there's going to be a ton of things why this is happening, but I do think it is, in part, you know, analogous to the fake news kind of case. Because part of the problem is that when people hear these conflicting views, right, scientist skeptics, especially if it's an area where they don't already have kind of a strong trust, either because they're worried about financial conflicts of interest, they're worried about misconduct. In some cases, it's mistrust because they think scientists, certain groups of scientists might have a political agenda, right? That what happens is when you already are sort of not feeling trustful, when you hear these claims, either you then just kind of revert to like, well, I'm going to believe my people, right? Or you think, well, I don't know who the heck to believe now. And when you are left thinking, I don't know who the heck to believe, you don't implement policy. You don't support policy. It stalls policy, right? So the worry is that, you know, those kind of skeptic challenges have, you know, much more traction in a context where you don't have trust. And that's what we're seeing with the media too, that people are distrustful of the media, and then they hear fake news and they're like, oh yeah, I knew it, you know, like fake news. Either they don't know who to believe, or they think, well, I'm going to stick to my outlet, my people's news source.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think we need to be careful. If you look at the political fact checkers and those websites, and you look at those, you know, when they're checking people's facts, most of those aren't about science.
That's right.
They're about
I agree with that.
They're about, you know, sensory perceptions. Well, you know, who had the bigger inaugural crowd? You know, Obama, or you know, that's a matter of perception. Or basic facts. You know, was Obama born in the United States? And those have nothing to do really with science. They just have to, so there's, what I'm suggesting is science is only one way that we interpret the world. And it's an important way, but it's only one way.
Kristen, you focus on trust in your book. And you say how to fix it. So how do you build trust? And how do you build an area where scientific contributions to human understanding will be trusted? Is it a matter of how to communicate, or the process of building? How do you get to your solution?
I mean, I think you know, it's probably many of those things. And I also think, I mean, part of the conclusions, you know, of the book is we also need to do more research, more social science research, to look at how trust can be kind of better facilitated and promoted within scientific communities. And it has to be done on many levels, the level of individual scientists, but also scientific communities and also institutions, right, like universities. For example, by doing things like, you know, having policies where you don't agree to certain kinds of stipulations in private grant funding. A lot of universities don't want to do that, right, because they're trying to bring in research dollars. But things that would potentially, you know, better implement the integrity of the research. And also things like, I do think it involves communication, because it isn't just about the science. I mentioned really briefly in passing values, but that's part of what plays a big role here. You know, science alone doesn't determine policy. You know, you also need some value judgments to get you kind of from the science to the policy. And even in the practice of science, like with the GMO case, some of the disagreement about GMOs is that people have disagreements about what constitutes safety. What is evidence for safety? And you know, how much evidence do we need to say that something's safe? And there's genuine disagreements about that. And so one way of facilitating trust is acknowledging those kind of value judgments that are at stake and engaging with stakeholders to have a bit broader conversation about some of those. Now, how you do that, and how you do that without grinding science to a halt because now they have to, you know, is a really hard question, you know. But I think, you know, in part we're trying to just try to shift the framework for how we think about some of these issues so that we can start thinking about some of those, about how to do that.
Stand up over here. Yes.
So, I'm going to use climate change as an example, but there's other ones that are out there. A lot of the climate change studies I've seen, they will have these bad outcomes at 2050. That's 30 years on, well over my current lifespan. Do you think that a current issue with science is that scientists look at 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, but most Americans are focused on the immediate short term, 1 to 2 years. Is that a disconnect view? So is it, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big problems about climate change ethics in general is that, you know, the kinds of predictions are not maybe the ones that are going to affect people right now immediately who are making policy decisions or voting right now. It's like how their grandchildren will be affected, right? And so I think there's a difficulty of, you know, how do you engage in policy making about these complex problems that have long-term consequences and get people to see their long-term interests as opposed to just their own individual interests. And that's, you know, that's hard to do. But it might start by just talking to people about things they do care about and, you know, things they care about for their grandkids. And their, you know, what kind of, you know, do they want their grandchildren to have, or their own children to have reproductive problems?
Pat, I've got a question for you that I can't wait. So when you were talking, I felt like you were almost being too hard on yourself. I can't hear what you're saying without hearing in my ear some issues about the ethics of journalism as well. I was tangentially connected to a project here on campus that I thought was exceedingly poorly reported in local news outlets. A lack of commitment to really understanding what was going on, a lack of commitment to the nuance and detail that would really help the public to appreciate what the project was actually about. And I wonder if when you do interviews and stand before media outlets, if you find yourself wondering if you should ask them, how detailed are you prepared to report here, right? I mean, it's one thing if you say, do you just want a soundbite, or do you want to actually understand these relatively complex issues? Do you ever find yourself tailoring what you say to the public media outlets based on how committed you think they are to actually accurately reporting what you're trying to describe?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So one of the bad things that's happened, science reporters have gone away. So newspapers used to have science reporters on their staff, and now they really don't. So lots of these science reporters are now writing blogs. And there are some reporters who are so good at what they do that they come to you already prepared and with great sets of questions. There are others that it's like, oh my gosh, who sent you to do this story? And so the only defense for me is I always ask them the same thing. You know, I try really hard to explain to them what I'm trying to say, but I ask them always, okay, can I request one thing? If you're going to quote me directly and ascribe words to me, would you just pass those quotes by me so I can make sure that what I was trying to say actually came out of my mouth? Really what I'm trying to find out is if you really could get this. And then I feel like, okay, if it doesn't say, Dr. Hunt says blah, 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 but it says something that's erroneous but not ascribed to me, then at least I'm not going to get the fall from my peers saying, how could you possibly have said that? But when you talk to reporters, you know, they tell you for USA Today, 8th grade, assume an 8th grade level of comprehension. So you really have to be able to talk to the people. And that means you really have to make things that are really, really hard very, very accessible. But you know, it's kind of easy to do some of it if you're a little bit mean. Because you can say, okay, so how much of a birth control pill would you be prepared to take? Half, would that be okay? Quarter, would that be okay? If you're a guy in the audience, you're going, oh God, that's estrogen, that's the female hormone. I don't want any of that. So you instinctively know that these little tiny pills are incredibly potent. And if I then can say to you, and you know, those same kinds of hormone-like effects are coming from these chemicals that you're in contact with every day through those receipts you handle, through those, you know, magic BPA-free beverage containers that now, yes, they don't contain BPA, but they contain some other bisphenol that's just a tweak on that BPA molecule that's just as bad. They get it then.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, this is also for Professor Hunt. And I just was going to ask, so you've talked a lot, when you talk about the importance of educating scientists in terms of being, you know, more media savvy or better to explain. But I also noticed that this is through the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, and the Foley Institute, which is, you know, political as well. So I was going to ask, either what are you doing for more science-focused audiences, or what do you think the university and the colleges and the departments should do in terms of giving science students more of a kind of a broader education?
So I had this dream once for an institute that would be the Murrow School of Communication, you guys in philosophy and policy, and we scientists, and we would all put our students into this pool and we would give them the education of their lives. and actually, I think that's one of the things that we could do, is actually understand lives on different sides of the campus. And scientists, we get into our own little world. We talk to ourselves. Most of us are terrible at it. When you go to meetings and you see these data-heavy talks, they're just awful. But when I start talking to first-year graduate students, and I start talking to them about what makes a good presentation, what things they don't need to put on their slides, making a point, they get it immediately. So what I think is the younger you get to people, the more chance you have of changing their behavior. And I think the older scientists are the ones who have the most trouble thinking about talking to the general public because they'll never understand. The younger ones are like, oh yeah, that elevator speech, I should be able to do this in 3 minutes or less, and I should be able to do it to anyone. And that's going to change science. Did I get it?
Yeah, Mike.
Okay, so I have a question, I think, for the whole group. So something that is kind of nice Stephen talked about it, and I think Professor Hunt talked about it as well, is we seem to often have a science policy firewall. I hear this often. For example, I was part of the climate change panel, and I had a couple of climate scientists on my panel, and those climate scientists said, oh, we've already done our job. We don't want to get involved in the policy. We don't want to get, it's actually your job now to communicate all this. And they were looking at me, the philosopher. It's your job to communicate this, and your job to help solve policy. So I guess something that I'd like to ask is, why do we have this resistance to scientists? Like Professor Hunt mentioned, she was counted as something exotic, somebody who actually wanted to be an activist and be considered her an activist. And what do we need? Why do we have this science policy firewall? What are the impediments to actually getting scientists to the table? Now, of course, it shouldn't be just all of a sudden the science dictates policy. There's probably more to it. We need policy experts involved as well. How do we get them to the table? And how do we get them to actually start talking about values? Because there's a lot of research that suggests we actually have similar values. No one's been elected on sort of issues saying, oh, you know, I've given this serious thought and to hell with the poor. I've given this serious thought, to hell with future generations. I've given this serious thought, to hell with the environment. No one's been elected on those claims. So I'm curious why scientists are so afraid and what are the impediments to actually getting scientists out there. It can't be because we think that science is going to be politicized, because the science is already politicized with scientists not engaging in politics. So I'm kind of curious, I'd like to hear from everybody what you might think about the science policy disconnect.
So I think a lot about it. But I think it would be really interesting if you went to my meetings and I went to your meetings, just to see the difference in how people act and interact, like social things. No. And I'm sure that you guys are completely the opposite. So I think we select for a certain kind of people, and we're very happy in our trenches. Thank you very much. Leave us alone. Let us just do our work, but keep funding us. We'll take your money. We don't need to talk to you about it, but we'll take your money. And I do think that needs to change, but I think it's also difficult because science is moving at such a rapid pace. To just keep up with your field has become almost an impossible mission. And to add on to that, keeping up in a global context with, a larger piece of science and how it impacts the world is really challenging. So we have to do these bioethics things every year. We send our students off for a week of bioethics training, and we call it good. I've decided that what we really need to do is we need to pick topics like GMOs, and we need to mix this into them. So one of my favorite things to do is take, the GMO issue, when it came up, should we label, should we not label, in California, and actually follow the money that was spent, because it's just illuminating. And I have students walk in every year to my class, and I say, we're going to have a debate at the end of this, and you're going to have to sign up on the pro labeling or the con. And of course, they're all, GMOs are great. We're scientists, we engineer things, and we make them better. By the end of the discussion, I have no trouble getting them to sign up for either side, because they realize they can equally well argue either side of the equation. And they really understand a lot more about how the world works, which we don't focus on how the world works. You guys do.
I think there's another piece of why there's the firewall there, which is that there's still a pretty dominant view within a lot of scientific communities among scientists of the kind of value-free ideal of science, that that somehow admitting that values play a role in science, or that having scientists might have a policy agenda, or somehow hinders or undermines their objectivity as scientists. So that there's a concern that in order to be objective, they have to stay away from kind of the policy stuff or not take a position on it. There's still even controversy about groups like the Union for Concerned Scientists, because some people think you're making things worse, you're advocating for policy, we're supposed to be neutral, we're supposed to be objective, leave it to the policymakers. And so I think we have to break that idea a little bit more, to sort of, see that values play kind of an important, necessary, and at the very least inevitable role in some of these things, and that we have to be able to have kind of more open conversations about them without people being in fear that they're then going to be charged with being biased, or that somehow their science is undermined.
So, Mike, I think you asked or conflated two different issues. One having to do with science in policy, and the other is trying to encourage scientists to get more involved. This has actually been studied. Mike's a colleague of mine. I can loan you some materials if you'd like. I direct your attention to Ann Keller's book. She's in the School of Public Health at Berkeley, and she studied this question of under what conditions will scientists get involved, and completely counter to what she thought going in. She thought it would be at the implementation phase where their facts could be brought to bear. Instead, they were more active in the problem definition stage. And she reasoned that they couldn't be pinned down then and have their reputations besmirched. And so they were looking out for their self-interest. There's also the issue, there's the old two communities hypothesis that you can't find two different sets of actors that are any different than scientists, and part of this is an objectivity and values, scientists and policymakers. They have completely different motivating contexts for their behavior. When I was working with the graduate students on the Inspire project, I mean, one of the hardest things to do with them was to break down this idea that if we just give them the right answers, they'll use them. Well, that's only one potential model. And so I think that becomes discouraging after a while. If you provide what you consider to be good science and they don't use it, then that gets frustrating, I think.
We have time for one more question. I'll give it to you.
I was wondering if you think that the universities are biased in like educating in such a polarized country, and it's mostly for you, Mr. Smith. And how do we maintain an unbiased education in political science?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of evidence, and this won't surprise anyone in the room, that the professoriate tends to be more left-leaning in their partisanship. And as a political scientist, I start every undergraduate class I have with the following comment. I'm not here to try to change your mind. I'm here to try to help you inform your decisions. And I hope at the end of the class that half of you think I'm too liberal and half of you think I'm too conservative. And that's my ideal sort of situation. I can't speak for my other colleagues. There's this idea of we have a certain amount of professional freedom to teach things the way we want to teach them. But there's also, we can't have biology people. In fact, there's court cases about this. Biologists can't start debating, political issues because it isn't germane to their class. So it's a tough question, particularly in light of these increasing attacks on universities as being out of touch, really, especially among one set of tribal members.
Please join me in thanking our panelists one last time. And thank you to you all for coming to the event. I'm glad you're here.